Andrew was the kind of man who rarely stopped moving. At 68, he still took pride in tending his little vegetable garden every morning, crouching among the tomatoes and basil, humming to himself as the sun rose. He enjoyed walking down to the cafe 2 streets away, where the barista knew his order by heart, a cappuccino and a smile. But one autumn morning, as he stood in line waiting for his coffee, he felt something strange. His legs felt unusually heavy, as though invisible weights had been strapped to his calves. By the time he reached the counter, there was a dull ache pulsing through his thighs and a prickling coldness creeping into his toes. He brushed it off at first, thinking perhaps he had overworked himself in the garden, but deep down, something about it unsettled him. That evening, the heaviness hadn't gone away. Andrew sat in his armchair, looking at his legs, noticing faint, bluish lines tracing under the skin like tiny rivers. They hadn't been there before, at least not like this. He remembered his father's legs toward the end of his life, swollen and roped with bulging veins. A flicker of worry passed through him, but he shook his head and told himself, "It's just age." Yet, as the days passed, the discomfort grew worse. There were moments when his calves cramped in the middle of the night, jolting him awake. His morning walks began to feel like small uphill climbs, even on flat streets. And the garden he loved so much? He found himself sitting on the bench more often than tending to the plants. His daughter Emily noticed before he fully admitted it to himself. "Dad, your legs look a bit swollen," she said one afternoon when she came to visit. He tried to wave it away with a chuckle, but she pressed gently, asking if he'd seen a doctor. Reluctantly, Andrew agreed. The appointment was short but sobering. The doctor explained that Andrew was showing clear signs of poor circulation, likely a combination of age-related vascular changes, a bit too much sitting during winter, and perhaps a touch of early varicose veins. "It's not life-threatening right now," the doctor reassured, "but if you ignore it, you could be facing blood clots, worsening swelling, or even serious cardiovascular issues." Andrew nodded politely, but inside the words "blood clots" and "serious issues" echoed like warning bells. That night, he lay in bed thinking about all the things he still wanted to do. The trips he'd promised Emily he'd take with her family, the fishing weekends with his old friends, even the simple joy of being able to wander the local market without feeling like he was dragging bricks. The idea of losing that freedom, of becoming dependent on others, unsettled him more than he could express. He thought about his father again, remembering how much it pained him to be unable to walk far without help. Andrew didn't want to follow the same path. The next morning, instead of brewing his usual coffee first thing, he made himself a pot of ginger tea. It was something his grandmother used to swear by whenever anyone in the family complained of feeling sluggish in the blood, as she called it. He sipped it slowly, letting the warmth spread through his chest and down his limbs. It was a small step, but it felt purposeful. That day, he decided he wasn't going to wait for things to get worse. He would take care of his circulation before it took away his independence. When I first met Andrew, he told me this story with a mixture of embarrassment and determination. As a health advisor who has spent decades helping older adults reclaim their mobility and vitality, I could see in his eyes that this was a man ready to make changes. I reminded him that while circulation problems are common as we age, they are not an inevitable sentence. Our bodies still respond beautifully to care, nourishment, and movement, sometimes more than we expect. But it's not always about running marathons or overhauling your diet overnight. Sometimes it starts with something as gentle and comforting as the right cup of tea. Over the weeks that followed, Andrew began a quiet transformation. He learned to listen to his body in ways he hadn't before. Instead of pushing through fatigue, he allowed himself moments of rest. Instead of defaulting to heavy lunches that left him sluggish, he embraced lighter, fresher meals that supported his vascular health. But perhaps most importantly, he began weaving herbal teas into his daily rhythm, not just as a health measure, but as a mindful ritual. Each cup was a reminder that he was choosing to care for himself, to keep his legs strong, his steps light, and his freedom intact. Herbal teas may sound simple, but they hold a kind of wisdom passed down through centuries. In many cultures, they are not merely drinks, but quiet medicines, offering anti-inflammatory relief, gentle stimulation for the heart and vessels, and calming effects on stress, which itself can strain circulation. When Andrew began exploring them with curiosity, it was as though he had opened a door to an entirely new way of tending to his body. one that was natural, pleasant, and deeply personal. This journey wasn't without its challenges. Some mornings he still woke up with stiffness in his calves. There were days he forgot to make his tea or felt too tired to prepare a pot. But he learned that progress wasn't about perfection, it was about persistence. Gradually, he noticed the changes. Less swelling in the evenings, fewer nighttime cramps, a new ease in his morning walks. One chilly afternoon, while visiting the market, he realized he'd been strolling for over an hour without that familiar dragging heaviness in his legs. He smiled to himself, thinking of that first cup of ginger tea and how far he had come since then. In the months since, Andrew's story has inspired others in his circle to pay attention to their circulation before it becomes a crisis. He's quick to tell them that while doctors and medicine play their role, there's a great deal we can do for ourselves, often starting with the simplest choices. He talks about how teas became his companions in healing, each one offering its own kind of support. And he reminds them that good circulation is not just about the legs, it's about feeling alive, energized, and ready to greet the day without hesitation. So as we step into this exploration together, I invite you to see these teas not just as recipes or remedies, but as part of a larger journey, a way of reclaiming the joy of movement, the comfort of light, pain-free legs, and the peace of knowing your heart and vessels are being cared for. Andrew's story is one of many, but perhaps, as you listen, you'll find a little of your own journey reflected in his. And maybe, just maybe, you'll discover that the path to better circulation and a healthier heart begins with the simple act of pouring yourself a warm, healing cup. Andrew didn't realize just how much his body had been whispering for his attention until those whispers became shouts. At first, it was only a hint of heaviness in his calves when he climbed the front steps, something he shrugged off as nothing. But lately, even the short stroll to his mailbox left his legs feeling oddly tired. He would catch himself rubbing at them absent-mindedly, wondering why they seemed slower to bounce back after a day in the garden. The changes were subtle enough that they might have gone unnoticed if it weren't for the way they began to steal the little pleasures he once took for granted. One chilly afternoon, Andrew was in the kitchen making himself a sandwich when he felt a sudden cramp shoot through his left calf. It wasn't just a small twinge, it was the kind of deep, twisting pain that made him grip the edge of the counter and wait for it to pass. He stood there, eyes closed, breathing through it until it finally loosened its grip. The ache lingered, though, as if to remind him that something wasn't quite right. He tried stretching, massaging the muscle, even warming it with a hot towel, but the discomfort seemed stubborn. That night, the cramp returned while he was lying in bed, jolting him awake. He sat up, pressing his hand into the muscle, wondering what could be going on. It was his daughter Emily who finally voiced what he hadn't dared to put into words. She was over for Sunday lunch, helping him clear the dishes, when she glanced down and frowned. "Dad, your legs look a little puffy. Have you noticed?" He looked, and sure enough, there was a faint swelling around his ankles. He told her it was nothing, just getting older. But Emily wasn't convinced. She insisted he book an appointment with the local clinic. Reluctantly, Andrew agreed, though a part of him dreaded what he might hear. The following week, he sat across from Dr. Patel, a calm-voiced physician with kind eyes. After a brief examination, she leaned back in her chair and explained what she saw. "Andrew, your circulation isn't as strong as it used to be. It's quite common at your age, but we need to keep an eye on it. If blood isn't moving through your legs efficiently, it can cause swelling, cramps, and even more serious problems down the line." She spoke of things like varicose veins and blood clots, not to frighten him, but to help him understand the stakes. "The good news," she said, "is that there's a lot we can do to improve it. You just need to be proactive." As Andrew walked home that day, her words echoed in his mind. Proactive. He realized how easy it had been to ignore the signs, to chalk them up to just age and carry on. But now he understood that these small discomforts were signals, and ignoring them would only give them permission to grow louder. He thought about the independence he valued so deeply, his daily walks, his afternoons in the garden, the freedom to visit friends without worrying if his legs would hold up. He didn't want to lose those things. That night, as he sat in his armchair, Andrew began to reflect on how his lifestyle might have contributed to the problem. Winters often made him more sedentary. He enjoyed reading in the afternoons and would sometimes lose track of time, sitting for hours without moving much. He also had a fondness for salty snacks. Something Dr. Patel had gently hinted might not be helping with the swelling, but more than anything, he realized he hadn't truly given his body the same attentive care he once had. He maintained the garden better than he maintained himself. The first small step was simply paying attention. He began noticing how often he sat without moving, how tight his shoes felt by evening, how his legs felt heavier on days he didn't walk. He started stretching lightly in the mornings, a habit he hadn't practiced in years. Emily bought him a pair of compression socks, which he wore reluctantly at first, but soon found gave him a surprising sense of lightness in his steps. But Andrew knew he wanted to do more than just manage the symptoms. He wanted to turn the tide. That's when he remembered something from his childhood. His grandmother, a gentle woman with silver hair and a knowing smile, always had a pot of herbal tea simmering on the stove. She would say, "Tea keeps the blood happy." As a boy, Andrew never thought much about it, but now the words felt almost prophetic. He began reading about teas that supported circulation, curious to see if something so simple could truly make a difference. It wasn't about chasing a miracle cure. Andrew understood that. It was about finding small, steady changes that could help his body do what it was meant to do. He began to see poor circulation not as a sentence, but as a challenge, one that could be met with daily choices. And in that quiet determination, a new chapter in his life began. Little did he know, the first tea he would try, a fragrant cup of ginger, would be the beginning of a ritual that would not only warm his mornings, but also bring strength back to his legs and hope back to his heart. Little did he know, the first tea he would try, a fragrant cup of ginger, would be the beginning of a ritual that would not only warm his mornings, but also bring strength back to his legs and hope back to his heart. That first sip felt like a quiet promise that he still had the power to change things. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a start. And sometimes that's all you need. The days that followed brought small victories. Andrew found himself looking forward to his morning tea, enjoying the way the steam curled upward like a signal of comfort. He began to notice subtle shifts, a little less heaviness in his calves when he walked to the corner store, a slight ease when climbing the porch steps. It was nothing dramatic, but it was enough to make him believe he was moving in the right direction. And belief, he realized, was half the battle. He kept his promise to himself to stay more active too. Every hour or so, he'd stand up, walk a lap around the house, stretch his ankles and calves. He even began dusting off the old radio in the kitchen and dancing lightly to familiar songs while waiting for the kettle to boil. These small, joyful movements reminded him that looking after his health didn't have to be a grim chore. It could be woven into the rhythm of his life, bringing both purpose and pleasure. Emily noticed the difference within a few weeks. "Dad, you seem lighter," she remarked one Saturday, watching him carry a basket of fresh vegetables from the garden. He smiled, a little proud, but also aware that the journey was still unfolding. He wasn't fixed, but he was no longer standing still in the face of his health concerns. He was moving, literally and figuratively, toward better days. And that felt like a victory worth protecting. The thing about circulation problems is that they don't always shout for attention. Sometimes they work quietly, slowly changing the landscape of your body without you realizing it. Andrew learned this during a follow-up visit with Dr. Patel a month after his first appointment. She explained that while he was doing well with his new habits, circulation issues could still be brewing beneath the surface. "Think of your veins as roads," she told him gently. "If traffic slows, things can pile up. And if those blockages stay hidden for too long, they can cause damage you can't see until it's serious." Andrew sat there, picturing his veins as winding country roads, some clear and open, others narrowing from years of wear. It made him think of the back lanes near his home, where weeds sometimes crept in and cracks in the pavement went unnoticed until they became deep potholes. The comparison made sense, and it unsettled him. He didn't like the thought of something quietly eroding his health while he went about his day, none the wiser. That night, as he pulled on his socks before bed, he studied his legs in the warm lamplight. There were faint, spidery lines on the backs of his knees and a bit of uneven coloring near his ankles. He ran his fingers over the skin, wondering how long these changes had been there. Had they appeared overnight, or had they been creeping in for years while he was too busy to notice? The realization made him think of his father again, not just the visible veins, but the way he had slowed down in his final years, as though the energy had been quietly siphoned away. The next morning, Andrew decided to pay closer attention, not in a fearful way, but in a mindful one. He noticed how his legs felt after different activities, lighter after a brisk walk, heavier after an afternoon of sitting with his crossword puzzles. He noticed how warmth seemed to soothe them, while cold left them feeling stiff. These small observations became part of his new self-care routine, helping him understand what his body needed. One afternoon, Emily stopped by with her 2 young children. They burst into the house full of energy, asking Andrew to join them in a game of tag in the backyard. For a moment, he hesitated, glancing down at his legs, but then he thought, if I want to keep them strong, I have to use them. So he stepped outside, laughing as the kids darted across the grass. His legs protested a little at first, but by the end of the game, he felt invigorated. Later, as he sipped his tea, he realized moments like these were part of the healing, not just for his body, but for his spirit. Dr. Patel's words about silent damage stayed with him. They didn't fill him with dread. Instead, they gave him resolve. If circulation problems could creep up quietly, then his defense would be to stay present, to catch the small changes before they became big ones. He began to think of his teas not just as warm drinks, but as allies, gentle yet persistent in their support, flowing through his body like steady rivers, keeping the roads clear. That's when Andrew decided he would take this journey seriously, not just for himself, but for the people who loved him. Emily had already lost her mother years ago. He didn't want her to lose him sooner than necessary to something he could help prevent. The thought of being there to walk her down the aisle when she renewed her wedding vows next spring, or to play with his grandkids without pain, became his quiet motivation. And with that, he leaned deeper into this path. One warm cup, one mindful step at a time. For Andrew, the change began in the smallest, simplest way, with a steaming cup of tea clasped between his hands on a crisp winter morning. It wasn't just any tea, it was the first deliberate step he'd taken since his diagnosis to nurture his circulation. He remembered his grandmother's words, "Tea keeps the blood happy," and as he inhaled the earthy, slightly spicy scent rising from the cup, he felt a quiet connection to her wisdom. It struck him how something so unassuming could carry such an air of promise. He didn't expect miracles. Andrew knew one cup wasn't going to erase years of subtle wear on his veins. But that morning, as he took his first sip, the warmth seemed to spread beyond his throat and chest. It felt like a message to his body. I'm paying attention to you now. That in itself was a powerful shift. It wasn't about the tea alone, it was about the act of choosing to do something, however small, that might help. For years, he had put his own health in the background, tending to his garden, his daughter, his friends, but not himself. This cup felt like a new conversation with his body, one he intended to keep having. In those early days, his tea ritual became a kind of anchor. Before, mornings were rushed affairs, a quick coffee, maybe toast, and then straight into chores. But now, he took a few extra minutes to boil the kettle, measure out the fragrant slices of fresh ginger, and let them steep until the water turned a golden hue. Some mornings he added a twist of lemon, others a teaspoon of honey. He realized these minutes were more than preparation. They were moments of slowing down, of allowing himself the grace to be still before the day carried him along. It was during one of these quiet mornings that Emily popped by unannounced. She found her father at the kitchen table, cradling his mug, looking out the window at the frosted garden. "Tea instead of coffee?" she teased, setting her bag down. He smiled. "Trying something different. Feels good." She took a seat and listened as he explained what Dr. Patel had said and how he was making small changes. Emily's eyes softened. "I'm glad you're doing this, Dad. I want you around for a long time." Her words settled warmly in his chest, reinforcing his resolve. As the days turned into weeks, Andrew noticed that he looked forward to this simple act each morning. It wasn't just habit, it was a ritual that carried meaning. The act of making tea, of holding it, smelling it, tasting it, reminded him daily that he was actively caring for himself. And somewhere in that repetition, he began to feel different. The heaviness in his legs was still there at times, but less insistent. The nighttime cramps didn't visit as often. He even found that his energy in the afternoons was steadier, less prone to the sudden dips that had become familiar over the years. One particularly cold morning, Andrew bundled himself up and walked down to the local farmer's market. The air was sharp, and for a moment he hesitated. Would the walk be too much today? But as he moved through the stalls, greeting familiar faces, he felt a lightness he hadn't felt in a while. He stopped at a vendor selling dried herbs and flowers, curious to see if there were other teas he might try. The woman behind the stand spoke with passion about hibiscus, ginkgo, and lemon balm, each with its own story and tradition. Andrew left with a small bag of hibiscus petals and the feeling that he was on the edge of discovering something more. At home, he experimented. Some afternoons, he brewed hibiscus for its tart, refreshing taste and vivid red color. On evenings when the day had left him tense, he reached for lemon balm to ease him toward rest. But ginger remained his steadfast morning companion, the tea that had started it all. He began keeping a small journal by the kettle, jotting down how he felt each day, not just physically, but emotionally. He wrote about walks that felt easier, about the time he knelt in the garden without the ache he expected, about the warmth in his hands on a cold day. What surprised Andrew most was how much this one habit began to ripple into others. The quiet satisfaction of his morning tea made him more mindful throughout the day. He found himself drinking more water, reaching for fresh fruit instead of biscuits, stretching his legs during television breaks. Without planning it, he had started building a small network of supportive habits, each one strengthening the others. It was as if the tea had become the keystone, holding the rest of his efforts together. Emily noticed too. One afternoon, she commented on how much brighter he seemed. "It's like you've got more spark in you, Dad," she said as they walked to the park with her children. Andrew chuckled. "Maybe I do. Feels good to take care of myself again." He didn't tell her that part of his motivation came from watching his own father's decline and wanting a different ending for himself. That was a quiet truth he carried alone, one that pushed him forward even on days he felt tired. Over time, the changes became clearer. The swelling in his ankles had eased, his legs felt stronger, and his steps carried a hint of the old spring. He wasn't cured, and he knew there would still be days when circulation troubles made themselves known. But he no longer felt like a passive passenger in his own health story. He was, once again, the one steering the wheel, and it had all begun with that simple sip, a moment he could have dismissed as nothing, but which turned out to be the start of something transformative. The tea itself was important, yes, but even more important was what it represented. The willingness to act, to make space for change, to believe that small steps could lead to better days. As Andrew rinsed his cup one evening, he found himself smiling. Who would have thought that something so simple could help him reclaim not just his circulation, but a part of himself he thought he'd lost? It was still dark outside the first morning Andrew decided to make ginger tea part of his daily ritual. The house was quiet, save for the low hum of the kettle heating on the stove. He reached for the fresh ginger root he'd bought at the market the day before, running his fingers over its knobbly skin. The scent released as he sliced into it was sharp and bright, a mix of earthiness and warmth that seemed to chase away the lingering chill in the kitchen. He dropped the slices into his mug, poured over the steaming water, and watched as the pale liquid deepened to a golden amber. It was almost meditative, the way the ginger swirled and softened in the heat. Andrew wrapped his hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into his palms, and took a slow, careful sip. The heat was immediate, not just in his mouth, but in the way it seemed to radiate outward, curling down into his chest and belly. He could feel it working, waking something up inside him. Dr. Patel had told him that ginger wasn't just good for flavor, it was a natural, circulatory stimulant, gently encouraging blood to move more freely through the body. Andrew didn't need a medical lecture to believe it. He could feel the difference within minutes. The stiffness in his legs eased just a little, and the sluggish fog that sometimes lingered in the mornings began to lift. There was a brightness to his mind, a readiness to face the day. In those early weeks, the tea became his morning companion. He started waking a bit earlier just to enjoy the quiet ritual before the day's noise set in. It wasn't just about the physical benefits, though he noticed those growing steadily. The reduced swelling in his ankles, the way his feet stayed warmer even in the cold, the fewer cramps at night. It was about what the tea symbolized, a deliberate choice to tend to himself, to make his health a priority instead of an afterthought. Emily was the first to point out the change. "Dad, you're walking faster these days," she remarked one afternoon as they strolled to the park. He grinned, a little surprised. "Am I?" she nodded. "You used to lag behind me, now I'm keeping up with you." The comment lingered in Andrew's mind long after they returned home. It wasn't just that he was moving more easily, it was that other people could see it too. One particularly frosty morning, Andrew decided to take his tea out onto the porch. The garden lay dormant under a thin layer of frost, but the air was fresh and bracing. He sat with the mug warming his hands, watching a pair of sparrows flit from branch to branch. With each sip, he felt his body relax into the moment. He thought about how, not long ago, mornings had begun with a rush of coffee and the vague hope that his legs wouldn't ache too much. Now they began with intention, with something that nourished him before the world made its demands. The more he read about ginger, the more it fascinated him. It wasn't some exotic superfood, it was a humble root, used in kitchens for centuries, trusted by healers across cultures. He liked that it was both ordinary and extraordinary, a reminder that powerful remedies often come from simple sources. In a way, it mirrored his own approach to recovery. Small, steady, grounded in the everyday. There were days when Andrew experimented with the tea. Sometimes he added lemon for brightness, sometimes honey for a soothing sweetness. On days when his joints felt stiff, he sprinkled in a pinch of turmeric, creating a golden blend that seemed to melt the tension in his knees. He began keeping a small basket of fresh ginger on the counter so it was always within reach. It became as much a staple in his kitchen as bread or eggs. But perhaps the most telling moment came one evening when Emily dropped by unexpectedly. She found Andrew in the kitchen, slicing ginger with the ease of someone preparing a cherished family recipe. "You really have taken to this tea," she said with a smile. He looked up, nodding. "It's become my morning boost. I can feel the difference, Em, not just in my legs, but in how I start my day." She stepped closer, touching his arm. "Then keep doing it, Dad. Whatever it is, it's working." And it was. The nightly cramps that had once jolted him awake were now rare visitors. The dull heaviness in his calves had lifted enough that he could tend to his garden without constantly seeking a chair. Even simple pleasures, like walking down to the market or climbing the front steps, felt easier. These weren't dramatic changes that happened overnight. They were gradual, like the way dawn slowly warms the sky. There was also a subtle shift in how Andrew carried himself. The man who had once accepted his aches and heaviness as part of just getting older now met each day with a quiet determination. He wasn't fighting his body, he was working with it, giving it what it needed to thrive. And in return, his body was responding with renewed strength and comfort. Some mornings, as he stood in the kitchen with the early light spilling across the counter, Andrew would think about how easily he might have missed this change. If he had dismissed the doctor's advice or ignored Emily's concern, he might still be waking with heavy legs and restless nights. Instead, he had chosen to act, and that choice began with something as simple as ginger steeping in hot water. It reminded him that caring for himself didn't have to be complicated or expensive. It just had to be consistent. And as he drained the last sip from his mug, he felt a quiet gratitude for the tea, for the small ritual, and for the life it was helping him reclaim, one warm morning at a time. It was on one of Andrew's quiet Saturday strolls to the farmer's market that he first noticed a small herbal stall tucked between the cheese vendor and the man who sold fresh-baked bread. The table was lined with glass jars, each labeled in neat handwriting, filled with dried leaves, petals, and roots. A woman in her 50s stood behind the stall, greeting passersby with a smile that felt instantly welcoming. Andrew lingered, scanning the jars, when one in particular caught his eye. Ginkgo biloba. "You know about ginkgo?" the woman asked, noticing his gaze. Andrew shook his head. "Not much, just that I've heard the name somewhere." She reached for the jar and loosened the lid. "Have a smell," she said, holding it toward him. The scent was faint, green, and slightly nutty. "It's been used for centuries," she continued. "Improves circulation, especially to the hands and feet. Keeps the blood flowing and the mind sharp." The mention of hands and feet made Andrew smile wryly. "I could use more warmth in both," he admitted. She chuckled and began explaining how ginkgo works gently, not like a quick jolt of caffeine, but more like a steady breeze through the body's narrow pathways. "It doesn't just help the legs," she said. "It encourages blood flow to the brain, fingers, toes, even the skin. You might find your hands aren't so cold in the mornings," she added knowingly. Intrigued, Andrew bought a small bag. That evening, after supper, he set about making his first cup. The dried leaves unfurled slowly in the hot water, releasing a pale, golden-green hue. The aroma was light, almost grassy, with a hint of earthiness. As he took his first sip, he found it subtler than ginger, less heat, more of a gentle freshness that seemed to unfold quietly as it moved through him. For the next week, Andrew decided to try ginkgo tea in the afternoons. He noticed something on the third day. While reading in his armchair by the window, he realized his fingers weren't icy, as they often were when the house cooled in the late afternoon. His toes, too, felt warmer inside his slippers. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to make him pause and wiggle them in appreciation. Emily came by midweek and noticed the new addition in his tea corner. "What's this one?" she asked, picking up the small jar. "Ginkgo," he said with a small note of pride. "Supposed to help with circulation, even to the brain. Who knows, maybe it'll keep me sharp enough to still beat you at Scrabble." She laughed, but she was glad to see him exploring beyond his first tea. "Well, if it helps your hands, I'm all for it. You're always complaining they're cold when we walk in the winter." By the end of the second week, Andrew felt a different kind of change, a certain lightness when he walked outside on cooler days. The biting chill that used to creep into his fingers didn't seem as quick to arrive. He even noticed he could write in his journal in the morning without that stiff awkwardness that used to plague his hands in colder months. It was subtle, yes, but he was starting to think the herbal stall lady might have been onto something. One evening, after making his tea, Andrew sat down to call his old friend Peter, who lived by the coast. They talked about fishing trips from years ago and how they both seemed to be collecting more little health quirks as they aged. Andrew mentioned the teas he'd been trying, and Peter laughed. "You sound like an old monk," he teased. But Andrew didn't mind. He knew these were more than quaint habits. They were tools helping him feel more like himself again. It wasn't just the warmth in his fingers and toes that made him keep brewing ginkgo. There was a certain calm alertness he began to notice. On afternoons when he drank it, his mind felt a touch clearer, less prone to that sleepy fog that sometimes settled after lunch. He found he could read longer without drifting off, and he even tackled a few crossword puzzles he'd been putting off. Whether it was the tea or just the satisfaction of taking control of his health, he didn't care. The result was the same. He felt more present in his own life. One particularly blustery day, Emily invited him to join her and the kids for a walk through the park. Andrew almost said no. The wind was sharp and he didn't feel like braving the cold. But he thought about the warmth he'd been feeling since starting ginkgo and decided to give it a try. As they strolled under bare-branched trees, he realized he wasn't tucking his hands into his pockets quite as often. The tip of his nose still caught the wind, but his fingers stayed comfortably warm. He even joined the children in tossing a few dry leaves into the air, laughing when they fluttered back down. That night, as he sat with his tea, Andrew thought about how ginkgo wasn't as bold or fiery as ginger. It was quieter, more understated, the kind of change that crept in slowly and stayed without fanfare. But he liked that about it. It felt like a gentle friend, steady and reliable, asking nothing but a little time each day to work its quiet magic. He also realized something else. This journey of adding teas wasn't just about fixing what was wrong, it was about rediscovering small joys, making space for moments that nourished him in ways beyond the physical. The act of brewing, the scent of the leaves, the warmth of the cup in his hands, all of it reminded him to slow down, to notice, to care. And in doing so, he was giving himself more than better circulation. He was giving himself a richer, fuller experience of the days he had. By the time the month ended, ginkgo had earned a permanent spot beside his ginger jar on the kitchen shelf. Mornings belonged to ginger for its bright, invigorating push, afternoons to ginkgo for its gentle, warming steadiness. Together they formed the rhythm of his days, one waking him up, the other helping him stay warm and clear. And though Andrew knew there were more teas ahead to explore, he took a moment to appreciate this pairing, this balance. In ginger and ginkgo, he'd found not just remedies, but quiet companions, each reminding him in their own way that change is possible, warmth can return, and that caring for oneself often begins with the smallest, simplest of acts. Andrew had never thought of garlic as anything more than a flavorful companion to his roast chicken or a key ingredient in Emily's pasta sauce. It was a kitchen staple, not something he associated with health in a deliberate, targeted way. But one rainy Thursday, while leafing through a small book on herbal remedies he'd picked up at the market, he stumbled across a section that stopped him mid-page. "Garlic," it read, "is a natural blood thinner, supporting healthy circulation and protecting the heart." He tilted his head, reading it again. The words "blood thinner" caught his attention. He thought about Dr. Patel's warning about clot risks and poor blood flow, and something clicked. Could something so ordinary really be such a powerful ally? He recalled hearing his grandmother talk about garlic's healing properties. But like most things she'd said about food, he had filed it away as old world wisdom. Now, with his own health nudging him toward action, those words felt worth investigating. That weekend, during his usual market run, Andrew made a point of stopping at the organic produce stall. He picked out a few plump, firm bulbs, their papery skins intact, and asked the vendor if she'd ever made garlic tea. She laughed and nodded. "Old remedy," she said. "Strong taste, but good for the blood. My grandmother swore by it." That was enough for Andrew. He tucked the garlic into his basket alongside fresh herbs, imagining how he might prepare his first cup. Back home, he peeled 2 cloves and sliced them thin, the sharp aroma filling his small kitchen. He dropped the slices into a mug and poured hot water over them, letting the steam rise in curling ribbons. The scent was bold, unmistakably garlic, but softened slightly by the heat. He took his first tentative sip. The flavor was strong, yes, but not unpleasant. There was a mellow sweetness that surprised him, a depth that reminded him of slow-roasted cloves. Over the next week, Andrew tried garlic tea a few evenings after dinner, curious to see how his body might respond. By the 3rd day, he noticed something unexpected, a subtle lightness in his legs, a sense that the heaviness he sometimes felt at night had eased. His calves didn't feel quite so tight when he climbed the stairs to bed, and the occasional restlessness in his feet seemed less insistent. One evening, Emily stopped by after work, catching him mid-sip at the kitchen table. She wrinkled her nose playfully. "Is that garlic?" He grinned. "Garlic tea," he confirmed. "Supposed to be good for circulation." She raised her eyebrows. "You really are turning into a tea connoisseur, Dad." He chuckled. "Well, I figure if it keeps my blood moving, it's worth it." She leaned over and kissed the top of his head. "Just don't drink it before church, all right?" Andrew began to appreciate the way garlic worked differently from his other teas. Ginger was like a friendly nudge in the morning, waking him up with warmth and spice. Ginkgo was a gentle stream, warming his hands and keeping his mind clear. Garlic, though, felt like a quiet guardian, standing watch over his blood, making sure it stayed free and flowing. It didn't feel dramatic or immediate, more like a steady presence, building its effect day by day. As the weeks passed, he found himself thinking about the broader picture. It wasn't just about tea anymore, it was about creating an environment in which his body could thrive. The teas were part of that, but so were the walks he took, the stretches he remembered to do, and the small adjustments he made to his meals. Garlic, in particular, reminded him that sometimes the most powerful solutions are the simplest, hidden in plain sight in the pantry. One afternoon, while chopping garlic for a soup, he thought about how this humble bulb had been part of human diets for thousands of years, cherished not just for flavor, but for its medicinal value. He felt a kind of kinship with generations past, people who, like him, had turned to nature for help with the ailments of life. There was something grounding about that, something reassuring in knowing he was carrying on a tradition of self-care that stretched back centuries. He also noticed that on evenings when he had garlic tea, his sleep seemed deeper. Whether it was coincidence or another subtle effect, he couldn't say, but he woke feeling more rested. The nighttime cramps that had plagued him months ago were now rare, and when they did appear, they were shorter, less intense. Even his morning walks felt easier, his stride more natural, less encumbered by the heavy, dragging sensation that used to make him cut his outings short. The real confirmation came one blustery winter evening. Andrew had been out shopping and was caught in a biting wind on the way home. In the past, his legs and feet would have felt stiff and sluggish by the time he reached his door. But that night, he noticed they felt surprisingly fine. Not warm exactly, but not painfully cold either. It made him think about the months of small choices he had made, how each cup of tea, each deliberate step toward caring for himself had been quietly adding up. He poured himself a mug of garlic tea that night and sat by the window, watching the lights in the houses across the street flicker on one by one. He thought about the man he had been before all this began, someone who dismissed his body's signals, who accepted discomfort as an unavoidable part of aging. And he compared him to the man he was becoming, attentive, curious, willing to change. The difference, he realized, wasn't just in his legs, it was in his mindset. Garlic might have been just one piece of the puzzle, but it represented something larger, the understanding that caring for yourself doesn't always require complicated treatments or expensive remedies. Sometimes it's about finding the small, steady things that quietly make a difference and giving them the time to work. Andrew smiled into his mug, grateful for this quiet guardian in his cup, and for the way it was helping him keep his legs and his life moving freely forward. It was during one of Andrew's routine check-ins with Dr. Patel that the conversation turned towards swelling. She asked whether his ankles still puffed up after a long day. Andrew admitted they did, especially if he'd been sitting for too long or spent an afternoon standing in the garden without much movement. Dr. Patel nodded thoughtfully. "There's a plant called horse chestnut," she said. "It's been used for a long time to strengthen vein walls and reduce swelling. You might find it helpful." The name struck Andrew as oddly familiar. He remembered as a boy collecting glossy brown conkers from the ground each autumn, stuffing them in his pockets like treasure. He had no idea those same trees held a secret that might one day help his legs. The thought made him smile. Dr. Patel explained that horse chestnut seeds contain compounds that support circulation by improving the elasticity of veins and reducing leakage that leads to swelling. "You can find it as a tea or extract," she said. "The tea is milder but still beneficial if you take it regularly." Later that week, Andrew set out on a small mission. At a health food shop downtown, he found a box of horse chestnut tea tucked on the lower shelf, its label decorated with drawings of the spiky green husks he remembered from childhood. He took it home, curious about what this new addition might feel like. That evening, he brewed his first cup. The aroma was mild, a little nutty, with a whisper of sweetness. It didn't have the boldness of ginger or the pungency of garlic, but there was something pleasant about its gentle character. For the first few days, Andrew didn't notice much, at least not consciously. But by the end of the first week, he realized his ankles weren't ballooning as much by evening. The skin felt less tight, and there was a lightness to his steps when he moved from room to room. It was subtle, but it gave him hope. He began drinking it every other day, alternating with his other teas, creating a little rotation that kept things interesting. One sunny afternoon, Emily stopped by with the grandchildren. They wanted to play a game of garden explorers, which involved hunting for bugs and interesting stones in the flower beds. Normally, Andrew would pace himself, bending down a few times before retreating to a chair to watch. But that day, he found himself crouching alongside them for longer stretches, pointing out earthworms and showing them how to spot tiny sprouts pushing through the soil. When he finally stood up, he realized with some surprise that his legs didn't feel as heavy as they usually did after that kind of movement. That evening, as he sipped his horse chestnut tea, Andrew thought about how swelling had crept into his life so gradually he'd almost accepted it as normal. He remembered the first time he'd noticed it months ago, how his socks had left deep impressions around his ankles, and how he'd shrugged it off. Now seeing that swelling ease even a little felt like reclaiming a small piece of freedom. The following week, Andrew went for a longer walk than usual. It was market day and the streets were busier than normal. He wove through the crowd, pausing at stalls and chatting with familiar faces. By the time he got home, he realized he hadn't once thought about whether his legs would pay for it later. That evening, there was still some puffiness, but far less than before. It was enough to make him believe the horse chestnut was quietly doing its work. Emily noticed too. "Your legs look better, Dad," she said one evening as they sat in the living room. "Less puffy?" Andrew smiled. "I think you're right. Feels better too. I've been trying this horse chestnut tea the doctor mentioned." She tilted her head, curious. "Horse chestnut? Like the trees?" He nodded. "Exactly. Turns out they're good for more than just conquer games." They both laughed, but there was an undercurrent of gratitude in his voice. As the weeks passed, horse chestnut tea became part of Andrew's evening wind-down routine. There was something fitting about it, the way it seemed to ease the day's wear from his legs, almost like a gentle thank you for carrying him through. He would sit by the window with his mug, watching the sky shift from orange to purple, and feel a quiet sense of relief as the swelling softened. He also began paying closer attention to how different teas made him feel, noticing the unique way each supported him. Ginger woke him, ginkgo warmed him, garlic guarded him, and horse chestnut seemed to lift the invisible weight he carried at the end of the day. Together, they formed a kind of personal care team, small, humble allies working quietly in the background. One evening, after an unusually active day in the garden, Andrew braced himself for the usual end-of-day heaviness. But as he settled into his chair with his tea, he realized it wasn't there. His legs felt tired in the way muscles do after good work, but they weren't aching or swollen. He ran a hand along his calf, marveling at how different it felt from just a few months ago. In that moment, Andrew understood something important. This wasn't just about the tea, it was about the cumulative effect of all the choices he'd been making. The walks, the stretching, the mindful eating, and yes, the teas. Each choice, small on its own, had been stacking quietly, reshaping his daily experience. The horse chestnut was simply the latest piece in a growing mosaic of self-care that was making his life better in tangible, everyday ways. As he drained the last sip from his mug, Andrew felt a wave of gratitude for the doctor who had suggested it, for the health food clerk who had stocked it, for his own willingness to try something new, and most of all for the way his legs now carried him, lighter and freer, into whatever tomorrow might hold. Andrew first heard about witch hazel not from a doctor, but from his neighbor, Margaret. She was a lively woman in her 70s with a knack for gardening and a deep belief in natural remedies. One afternoon, as they chatted over the fence, she noticed Andrew rubbing the back of his calf. "Legs bothering you again?" she asked. He admitted they'd been a little achy after the weekend's gardening. Margaret leaned in conspiratorially. "You should try witch hazel tea. My sister swears by it for her veins. Says it keeps them from getting worse." The name made Andrew chuckle. Witch hazel sounds like something out of a fairy tale, but Margaret only smiled knowingly. "Don't let the name fool you. It's been around for generations. Good for tightening up weak veins and calming inflammation. You can drink it or even use it as a compress." Curiosity got the better of him. That weekend, Andrew walked to the herbal shop in town. The owner, a silver-haired man with twinkling eyes, nodded approvingly when Andrew asked about witch hazel. "Astringent and soothing," he said. "It strengthens the walls of your veins, which can help with swelling and those little spider veins that like to show up with age. The tea's gentle, but effective if you stick with it." Andrew bought a small bag of dried witch hazel leaves and bark, intrigued by the idea that this unassuming plant could protect the very veins he was trying to care for. That evening, he brewed his first cup. The aroma was earthy with a faint hint of sweetness. The flavor surprised him. Mild, almost woody, with a clean finish. Not bold like ginger or garlic, but there was a grounding quality to it, something that felt steady and dependable. For the first few days, Andrew drank it in the late afternoon after his walk. It quickly became part of his routine. He'd come home, change into his slippers, and put the kettle on. The warmth of the tea seemed to melt away the tension in his calves. By the end of the first week, he noticed his legs didn't feel quite as restless in the evenings. The light throbbing he sometimes felt at night had softened. One evening, Emily stopped by with the children, who ran straight into the backyard to play. She noticed the mug in his hand. "Another new tea?" she teased. He grinned. "Witch hazel. Apparently it's a friend to tired veins." Emily laughed. "You're going to have the healthiest tea cabinet in town." But she was glad to see her father so engaged in his own well-being. As the days went by, Andrew began to see witch hazel as a kind of silent protector. It didn't shout for attention with a fiery flavor or dramatic immediate effects. Instead, it worked quietly in the background, like a sturdy fence around a garden, holding everything in place so the flowers could thrive. His evening swelling continued to lessen, and the faint, purplish lines behind his knees seemed less prominent. One cool Saturday morning, Andrew decided to take a longer route on his walk to the market. The path wound gently uphill, a stretch he usually avoided because it left his legs feeling heavy. But this time, he took it at his own pace, breathing in the crisp air. By the time he reached the top, he was surprised to find he wasn't gasping or desperate to sit down. His legs felt capable, strong. That night, with a cup of witch hazel tea warming his hands, Andrew thought about how much had changed in just a few months. Not long ago, the idea of climbing that hill would have felt daunting. Now it felt like an achievable challenge, something he could do without paying for it later with swelling and aches. He knew the teas weren't magic bullets, but they were part of a larger picture of care he was painting for himself. He also liked that witch hazel connected him, in a way, to the generations before him who had turned to plants for healing. He imagined settlers using it in poultices for sore legs after long days of walking, or farmers brewing it to soothe aching muscles after harvest. There was comfort in that continuity, in knowing he was following a path well trod by those who came before. One afternoon, Margaret caught him in the garden and called over, "How's that witch hazel treating you?" Andrew smiled. "Doing me good, I think. Legs are holding up better these days." She nodded in approval. "Told you so." From then on, witch hazel became Andrew's late-day ritual. After tending to the garden or returning from errands, he'd settle into his armchair, tea in hand, and let the quiet of the evening settle around him. It was more than just a drink, it was a moment of gratitude for the progress he'd made, for the strength returning to his legs, and for the small, simple things that were helping him keep his independence. And while he knew there were still more teas to explore, he also knew that witch hazel had earned its place in his journey. It was, in its own quiet way, helping him stand taller, walk longer, and face each day with a little more confidence in the legs that carried him. It was a crisp Tuesday morning when Andrew wandered into a small Mediterranean grocery he'd never visited before. He had been on his way to pick up fresh bread, but was drawn inside by the warm smell of herbs and spices drifting from the open door. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with jars of olives, bottles of golden oil, and packets of dried herbs tied with simple twine. As he browsed, his eyes landed on a bag labeled olive leaves. The shopkeeper, a man with a kind face and an accent Andrew couldn't quite place, noticed his interest. "Olive leaf tea," he said, stepping closer. "Very good for the heart and blood. My grandmother used to drink it every day." He went on to explain that olive leaves help keep arteries clear, protect against plaque buildup, and reduce inflammation. "Keeps the years from settling too heavily on you," he added with a knowing smile. Andrew was intrigued. He'd always associated olives with healthy eating, but he'd never considered the leaves themselves. He thought about the way Dr. Patel had explained circulation, how clean, flexible arteries were like smooth roads for the blood to travel on. If olive leaf tea could help keep those roads open, it might be another useful ally in his growing collection of daily supports. He bought a small bag and hurried home to try it. The dried leaves were slender and pale green with a faint, pleasant aroma. He spooned a handful into his teapot, poured hot water over them, and let the brew steep until it turned a delicate gold. The taste surprised him, mild and slightly floral with a gentle bitterness that reminded him of good olive oil. It was soothing, yet refreshing, the kind of tea he could imagine drinking often without growing tired of it. Andrew decided to make olive leaf tea part of his mid-morning routine. After his breakfast and a short walk, he'd settle at the kitchen table with his steaming mug. Within a week, he noticed something subtle. His energy in the late morning felt steadier, without the little slump he sometimes had before lunch. It wasn't a burst of energy like coffee might give, it was quieter, a sustained sense of alertness. One morning, Emily stopped by and found him sipping from his mug. "What's today's tea?" she asked with a grin. "Olive leaf," he replied. "Supposed to keep my arteries young." She laughed softly. "Well, you do seem more energetic these days," he shrugged. "Could be the tea, could be all these little changes adding up." As the weeks passed, Andrew found himself thinking more about the idea of keeping young, not in the sense of pretending he was 30 again, but in preserving what he valued most: mobility, clarity, independence. The olive leaf tea became a quiet reminder that even small choices could help protect those things. One particularly windy day, he decided to walk to the post office, which was a bit farther than his usual errands. In the past, the trip might have left his legs feeling tired and his breath short. But this time, he returned home feeling good, almost invigorated. As he set his keys on the counter, he realized he hadn't thought once about his legs slowing him down. It struck him as another small victory, one that might have seemed insignificant months ago, but now felt like proof he was moving in the right direction. In the evenings, Andrew liked to read about the history of the teas he was trying. He learned that olive leaves had been used in traditional medicine for centuries, valued not just for their cardiovascular benefits, but also for their ability to support the immune system. There was something deeply comforting about this connection to the past, knowing he was part of a long line of people who had turned to the same leaves for strength and resilience. One Saturday, while having tea with Margaret in the garden, Andrew offered her a cup of olive leaf tea. She took a sip, nodded, and said, "Smooth. I could drink this every day." He smiled. "That's the plan." They talked about how they both wanted to keep doing the things they loved for as long as possible. Gardening, walking, playing with grandchildren. "It's not about living forever," Margaret said. "It's about living well while we're here." Andrew couldn't have agreed more. By the end of the month, olive leaf tea had found a permanent place in Andrew's routine. It wasn't dramatic or flashy, but it offered something just as valuable: quiet, steady protection for the roads his blood traveled every moment of every day. Combined with his other teas, it felt like another strong pillar holding up the life he wanted to keep living. One morning, as he sipped his tea by the window, Andrew watched a pair of sparrows darting through the bare branches of his garden. He thought about how those small birds, so light and quick, managed to survive winter, year after year, by conserving their energy and making wise use of what was available to them. In a way, he realized, that was what he was doing too, finding small, consistent ways to protect himself, to keep moving with ease, to make the most of each day. Olive leaf tea, like so many of the simple choices he'd made in recent months, was helping him do exactly that. And as he drained the last sip from his cup, he felt a quiet gratitude, not just for the tea itself, but for the way it reminded him that caring for himself didn't have to be complicated. It just had to be consistent. Andrew discovered lemon balm almost by accident. It was a breezy Saturday morning, and he'd gone to the farmer's market to pick up fresh vegetables and a loaf of crusty bread. At the far end of the market, near a stall overflowing with bunches of lavender and rosemary, he noticed a small basket filled with leafy green bundles tied with string. A handwritten sign read, "Lemon Balm, Calming Herb." He picked up a bundle, rubbing one of the soft, heart-shaped leaves between his fingers. A light, citrusy scent rose instantly, fresh and uplifting. The woman tending the stall smiled. "Ah, lemon balm," she said warmly. "Good for calming the mind and relaxing the body. Also helps with sleep, and it's gentle on the heart." Andrew raised an eyebrow. "Gentle on the heart?" She nodded. "Stress isn't just in your head. It tightens the body, narrows blood vessels, and makes the heart work harder. Lemon balm can help ease that." That afternoon, Andrew decided to try it. He boiled water, dropped a small handful of fresh leaves into his teapot, and let them steep. The tea emerged pale green with a faint golden tint, and the aroma filled his kitchen with a soft, lemony perfume. The first sip was mild and refreshing, with just enough citrus to brighten the palate without overpowering it. He felt his shoulders drop almost involuntarily. Over the next few days, Andrew began drinking lemon balm tea in the evenings, especially after a busy or stressful day. He noticed a curious thing. Not only did it help him feel more at ease, but his legs also seemed lighter on days when he drank it. He remembered what the woman at the market had said about stress tightening the body. It made sense. When he was calmer, he naturally moved more and the blood flowed more freely. Emily noticed the change too. "You seem more relaxed these days, Dad," she commented one evening as they sat on the porch. He smiled. "I think it's the lemon balm. Helps me wind down. Makes my evenings feel softer somehow," she chuckled. "If tea can do that, maybe I should start drinking it too." One particular evening stood out. Andrew had been feeling restless all day, unable to settle his thoughts. Instead of reaching for the television remote, he brewed a cup of lemon balm tea and took it into the garden. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He sat quietly, sipping slowly, watching the first stars appear. By the time he finished his cup, the tension in his chest had eased and his breathing felt slower, steadier. He realized then that part of his circulation journey wasn't just about what he drank or ate, it was also about the state of his mind. When stress crept in, his body tightened, his breathing shortened, and even his legs felt heavier. But when he allowed himself to relax, everything seemed to move more smoothly, inside and out. Lemon balm was helping him find that state more often. Within a few weeks, the tea became his gentle nightly ritual. Sometimes he paired it with a chapter from a good book, other times with quiet moments by the window watching the neighborhood settle into the evening. On nights when the wind rattled the windows and winter's chill pressed against the house, the warmth of the tea felt like a small shield, wrapping him in comfort. Margaret, his neighbor, tried a cup one evening when she dropped by to return a garden tool. She took a sip and sighed. "It's like my whole body just unclenched." Andrew grinned. "That's exactly it." From then on, they occasionally shared a pot between them, chatting about the day while the steam curled gently from their mugs. The more Andrew thought about it, the more he saw lemon balm as more than just a calming tea. It was a way of signaling to himself that the day's work was done, that it was time to release the weight of the hours and let his body rest. And in that rest, his circulation found its own rhythm again, smooth, unhurried, steady. One night, after a particularly long day helping Emily with a home project, Andrew noticed something remarkable. Usually, after so much bending, lifting, and walking, his calves would be sore and a little swollen. But that evening, as he settled in with his lemon balm tea, he realized they felt surprisingly comfortable. He couldn't say it was all thanks to the tea, but he knew the calm it brought was playing its part. It reminded him of something Dr. Patel had said early in his journey: your heart and your blood vessels don't work in isolation. They're part of the whole you, body, mind, and spirit. Take care of one and you help the others. Lemon balm, in its quiet, fragrant way, was helping him do just that. By the end of the month, Andrew had a fresh bundle of lemon balm hanging in his kitchen to dry, ensuring he'd have a supply through the colder months. He liked the look of it, a little reminder every time he walked past that calm was always within reach, just a kettle and a few leaves away. And so, lemon balm earned its place among his growing family of teas, each one with its own role to play, each one offering something unique. For Andrew, lemon balm wasn't just the tea that calmed his mind, it was the tea that taught him that caring for his circulation also meant caring for his peace. Andrew first noticed hibiscus tea while browsing the herbal section of his favorite grocery store. The package caught his eye instantly, a vivid image of deep crimson petals spilling from a clear glass teacup. The color alone felt alive, as though it carried the warmth of a tropical sunset. He picked it up, reading the label. Rich in antioxidants, supports healthy blood pressure and circulation. He remembered the vendor at the market mentioning hibiscus months ago, saying it was good for the heart. Back then, he'd tucked the information away, focusing on the teas he was already trying. But now, with his energy steadily improving and his curiosity growing, he felt ready to welcome another ally into his routine. That afternoon, Andrew brewed his first cup. As the hot water touched the dried petals, they released a deep red color that spread through the pot like ink in water. The aroma was tangy and fruity, reminding him faintly of cranberries. He took a careful sip, and the flavor was bright, slightly tart, with a refreshing edge. It was unlike any tea he'd had before. Over the next few days, hibiscus tea became his mid-afternoon treat. It was invigorating without being overwhelming, a gentle lift that seemed to smooth away the fatigue that sometimes crept in after lunch. On the third day, he noticed something interesting. His mood felt lighter, almost buoyant. Whether it was the tea or the growing satisfaction of caring for himself, he wasn't sure, but he welcomed it. Dr. Patel had once explained that hibiscus could help relax blood vessels, making it easier for blood to flow. Andrew thought about that as he sipped his tea on a sunny Tuesday, the steam rising like a thin ribbon into the air. He imagined those vessels loosening just a little, the blood moving freely like water down a clear stream. The thought alone was comforting. One weekend, Emily stopped by to help him rearrange the furniture in the living room. They worked side by side for a couple of hours, moving the sofa to make space for a reading corner near the window. Normally, such a project would leave Andrew's legs feeling heavy by evening. But that night, as they sat together sipping hibiscus tea, he realized they felt surprisingly light. "Maybe it's all this tea I'm drinking," he joked. Emily smiled. "Whatever it is, it's working. You're not slowing down like you used to." Andrew liked that hibiscus was so visually striking. He often brewed it in a glass teapot just to watch the petals swirl and unfurl, releasing their color into the water. It felt like a small celebration in the middle of the day. Sometimes he poured it over ice with a slice of lemon for a refreshing drink on warmer afternoons. Other times, he mixed it with a bit of honey for a softer, sweeter flavor. One afternoon, his neighbor Margaret dropped by with a plate of lemon biscuits. Andrew offered her a cup of hibiscus tea to go with them. She took one sip and widened her eyes. "Oh, this is lovely. Tastes like summer," he nodded. "And it's good for your circulation. Helps keep the heart strong," she laughed. "Leave it to you to turn tea into medicine." But she finished her cup and asked for another. Over the weeks, Andrew noticed something subtle. His blood pressure readings, which he checked occasionally at home, were consistently a little lower than before. They had always been in the safe range, but now they seemed even steadier. He remembered reading that hibiscus could support healthy blood pressure, and while he didn't credit the tea alone, he felt it was certainly contributing to the overall improvement. There was also an emotional comfort in knowing he was adding something to his days that was both enjoyable and supportive of his health. Hibiscus became a reminder that caring for himself could be pleasurable, not a chore or a restriction, but a gift he gave himself. It was a far cry from the man who, months ago, had quietly resigned himself to heavier legs and restless nights. One rainy afternoon, Andrew brewed a pot of hibiscus tea and sat by the window, watching droplets race down the glass. He thought about the small army of teas he had gathered over these months, each one with its own personality, its own way of helping. Ginger gave him energy in the morning, Ginkgo warmed his hands, garlic guarded his blood, horse chestnut lightened his legs, witch hazel protected his veins, olive leaf kept his arteries young, lemon balm calmed his mind. And now hibiscus, with its bold color and bright flavor, was adding its own gift, helping his heart and lifting his spirits. As he sipped, he realized this journey had become about more than circulation. It was about reclaiming the parts of himself that had quietly slipped away. It was about waking up with a sense of possibility, walking without dread of discomfort, ending the day with gratitude rather than frustration. Hibiscus, in its vivid red way, reminded him that life could still be vibrant at any age, that care and joy could flow together, much like the tea itself swirling in his cup. And as he finished the last sip, he decided hibiscus had earned a permanent place in his afternoon routine, right alongside the other faithful companions that were helping him keep his heart strong and his legs free. Andrew had always known turmeric as the golden spice that gave curry its warm color. He remembered watching his late wife, Sarah, stir it into soups and stews on cold winter days, saying it warmed the body from the inside. But he'd never thought of it as more than a flavor until one chilly afternoon when Dr. Patel mentioned it during a casual check-in. Inflammation is like rust on your body's machinery, she explained, tapping her pen gently against his chart. It can make your blood vessels stiff and your circulation sluggish. Turmeric is one of nature's best tools for keeping that rust from building up. Drink it regularly, and it can help your vessels stay smooth and open. That night, Andrew rummaged through his spice cupboard and found a small jar of turmeric powder, its bright color glowing even in the dim kitchen light. He decided to brew his first cup then and there. He added a teaspoon of the powder to a mug, along with a pinch of black pepper, something he'd read could help the body absorb turmeric's goodness. Pouring in hot water, he stirred until the water turned a rich, golden orange. The scent was earthy and warm, like sunshine trapped in spice. His first sip was bold, slightly bitter, with a warmth that seemed to linger in his mouth and chest. It wasn't like the gentle teas he'd been drinking. Turmeric had presence, but there was something grounding about it, and by the time he reached the bottom of the cup, he felt a calm warmth spread through him. Andrew began making turmeric tea every few evenings. Sometimes he added ginger for a spicier kick, other times a dash of cinnamon for sweetness. On nights when the cold seeped into his knees, he made what he called his golden milk. Turmeric simmered gently with milk and honey. It became a small comfort, the kind that made winter evenings feel less harsh. Within a couple of weeks, he noticed his joints felt looser in the mornings. The slight stiffness he'd come to expect when stepping out of bed seemed less pronounced. Even his legs felt more cooperative during his daily walks. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but it was a welcome one. Emily noticed too. One Saturday, they decided to tackle a bit of yard work together. After a couple of hours raking leaves and trimming branches, she looked over at her father, expecting to see him reaching for the nearest chair. Instead, he was still moving, still chatting, his face lightly flushed from the crisp air. "You've got more stamina these days," she said, a little surprised. Andrew grinned. "Might be all these teas I'm drinking, or maybe I just don't want to be shown up by my own daughter." Margaret, his neighbor, was curious when she saw him stirring a mug of golden liquid one evening. "What's that?" she asked over the fence. "Turmeric tea," he said. "Good for inflammation and keeping the blood moving." She wrinkled her nose. "I've heard of it, but never tried it." Andrew poured her a small thermos the next day. She returned it empty with a smile. "Not bad. I might just steal that idea from you." Turmeric became more than just another tea in Andrew's rotation. It felt like a protective layer, something that worked deep in the background to keep his body supple and resilient. He liked the idea that while he went about his day, walking, gardening, reading, turmeric was quietly helping his blood vessels stay open and his circulation steady. One particularly cold morning, Andrew decided to test himself. Instead of taking the shorter loop on his walk, he chose the longer path that wound through the park. There was frost on the grass and the air was sharp, but his legs moved easily beneath him. He made it home without that familiar heaviness settling in. Standing in his kitchen afterward, mug of turmeric tea in hand, he felt quietly triumphant. He thought about how far he'd come since those first heavy-legged days. Back then, he had accepted discomfort as a sign of getting older. Now, he saw it as a challenge he could meet. Not with grand, exhausting efforts, but with small, steady habits that worked together over time. Turmeric was now one of those habits, bright and golden in his cup, quietly keeping him moving forward. That evening, as the golden tea warmed his hands, Andrew looked at the row of jars and boxes on his kitchen shelf. Each tea had its own story, its own role in helping him reclaim his strength. Turmeric, with its earthy depth and sunny color, was like a steady friend, not flashy but loyal, working quietly to keep the rust at bay. And as he took another sip, he thought about how these small choices, made day after day, were adding up to something bigger than he could have imagined. Not just better circulation, but a better life. Andrew had always loved the smell of cinnamon. It reminded him of winter mornings when Sarah would bake warm rolls, the sweet, spicy scent filling the house before they even had their first cup of coffee. For him, cinnamon was comfort, the aroma of home, but until recently, he'd never thought of it as more than a flavoring for pastries and desserts. One day, while reading through a booklet on heart-healthy foods he'd picked up at the community center, he came across a section on cinnamon. According to the booklet, cinnamon could help regulate blood sugar, reduce bad cholesterol, and even improve circulation by relaxing blood vessels. It struck him that something so familiar, something he already enjoyed, could also be working quietly to protect his heart. That evening, Andrew rummaged through his spice cupboard and found a small jar of cinnamon sticks. He decided to brew a simple cinnamon tea, just 2 sticks in a pot of simmering water. The kitchen soon filled with a scent so warm and inviting that he felt like winter had arrived early. The tea emerged a deep amber color, and the first sip was sweet and gently spicy, warming him from the inside out. He began making cinnamon tea a few times a week, usually in the late afternoon when the air cooled and the light slanted through the kitchen window. It quickly became a small ritual, a moment to pause, inhale the comforting scent, and feel the gentle heat work its way through his body. Within a couple of weeks, Andrew noticed he wasn't reaching for sweet snacks in the afternoons as often. Cinnamon seemed to satisfy his craving for something rich and comforting without leaving him sluggish afterward. Emily noticed too. "You've lost a bit of that belly," she said one Saturday, patting his midsection with a grin. Andrew chuckled. "Maybe it's the cinnamon keeping me out of the biscuit tin." He also began to realize that cinnamon had a different kind of warmth from ginger or turmeric. Ginger woke him up. Turmeric grounded him. Cinnamon felt cozy. It wasn't just warming his body, it was soothing his spirit. It reminded him of holidays past, family dinners, and evenings by the fire. That comfort, he thought, was its own kind of medicine. One rainy evening, Andrew invited his neighbor Margaret over for tea. She had been feeling a little low, worn out from tending her garden in the unpredictable autumn weather. He served her cinnamon tea with a touch of honey. As she sipped, she closed her eyes and smiled. "This tastes like kindness," she said softly. Andrew knew exactly what she meant. Over time, he noticed subtle shifts in his energy and mood on days he drank cinnamon tea. He felt steadier, less prone to the mid-afternoon dips that sometimes left him dragging his feet. His evening walks felt easier, his steps lighter. Whether it was the tea's effect on his circulation or simply the way it warmed and encouraged him, he was happy to make it a regular part of his week. One Sunday morning, while preparing his tea, Andrew thought about how each of his chosen teas played a different role in his life. Ginger gave him his morning spark, ginkgo warmed his hands, garlic guarded his blood, horse chestnut lightened his legs, witch hazel protected his veins, olive leaf kept his arteries clear, lemon balm calmed his mind, hibiscus lifted his heart, turmeric fought inflammation, and now cinnamon was here, quietly tending to his heart and spirit. It was a comforting thought, like knowing he had a small team of helpers supporting him every day. He began experimenting, sometimes blending cinnamon with other teas. One of his favorites became a mix of cinnamon and hibiscus, the tart brightness of hibiscus balanced by cinnamon's sweetness. On colder days, he combined cinnamon with turmeric for a deeper, earthier warmth. Each variation felt like a new discovery, another way to enjoy the benefits while keeping his routine fresh. As autumn turned to winter, Andrew found himself leaning on cinnamon tea more often. The cold air outside seemed to make its heat more welcome, and the scent turned his quiet kitchen into a place of comfort even on the darkest days. Sometimes, as he sat with his tea, he would close his eyes and remember Sarah's cinnamon rolls, the laughter around the table, and the way those moments had warmed him in ways no fire ever could. It struck him that this journey he was on, adding these teas one by one, was as much about remembering as it was about healing. Each tea carried a memory, a feeling, a piece of himself he wanted to keep alive. Cinnamon, perhaps more than any other, reminded him that health wasn't just about blood vessels and circulation. It was also about the heart in the truest sense, the place where love, comfort, and connection live. And so, as the days grew shorter and the nights colder, Andrew kept his jar of cinnamon sticks on the counter, ready at hand. Each cup was a quiet act of care, for his body, for his memories, and for the life he was still building, one warm sip at a time. By now, Andrew's kitchen shelf had transformed into what Emily jokingly called his tea apothecary. Neat jars and tins lined up side by side, each labeled in his tidy handwriting. Ginger, ginkgo, garlic, horse chestnut, witch hazel, olive leaf, lemon balm, hibiscus, turmeric, cinnamon. Looking at them gave him a quiet sense of satisfaction. They weren't just teas anymore, they were companions on this journey, each with its own place in his day. What had started as a few experimental cups had become a steady rhythm, a structure that carried him through the week. Mornings always began with ginger, bright, warm, and invigorating, like the sun rising inside his chest. Mid-morning was for olive leaf, its subtle strength reminding him that protection could be quiet. Afternoons alternated between ginkgo to keep his hands and feet warm, and hibiscus, whose vibrant color seemed to put a spark in his mood. Evenings were gentler, lemon balm for calm, witch hazel for steady veins, horse chestnut for lighter legs. Turmeric and cinnamon were flexible, sometimes ending his evenings, sometimes slipping into the day when he felt he needed their grounding warmth. Andrew didn't see it as a strict regimen. It was more like a conversation with himself. Each day he asked, "How am I feeling? What do I need today?" Some days called for the bold kick of ginger twice in one day. Others asked for the quiet steadiness of witch hazel or the comforting hug of cinnamon. He had learned to listen, and in listening he found a deeper connection with his own body. It surprised him how much joy he found in the process. The act of boiling water, measuring leaves, waiting as they released their color and scent. It was a small ceremony, a pause that slowed the day's pace just enough to notice it. He realized it wasn't only the tea working to improve his circulation, it was also these mindful moments, these gentle breaks that reminded him he was worth the care and time. One Saturday morning, Emily and the grandchildren came over to bake cookies. The kitchen filled with the smell of butter and sugar, the chatter of small voices, the occasional clatter of a dropped spoon. While the cookies baked, Andrew set about making tea for everyone. Ginger for himself, chamomile for the children, lemon balm for Emily. She took her first sip and sighed. "You've really made this into something special, Dad. It's not just tea anymore, it's part of who you are now." Her words stayed with him. She was right. The ritual wasn't just about health anymore. It had become a part of his identity, a daily thread woven into the fabric of his life. And as his circulation improved, as his legs grew lighter and his energy steadier, he saw that these rituals were not separate from the results. They were the results. Some evenings, Andrew would invite his neighbor Margaret over for tea. They would sit at the small table by the window, cups in hand, and talk about the day. Sometimes the talk was light, garden pests, the weather, recipes. Sometimes it was heavier, loss, aging, the quiet loneliness that could creep in on long nights. The tea was always there between them, a comfort they both could hold. There was one evening in particular that Andrew would remember. A winter storm had swept in, rattling the windows and coating the street in white. He and Margaret sat inside, safe and warm, sipping cinnamon turmeric tea. The snow muffled the world outside, and for a while the only sounds were the clink of spoons and the low hum of their voices. Andrew thought about how far he'd come since the days when walking to the mailbox left his legs aching. Here he was, strong enough to shovel his walk earlier that day, light enough on his feet to move easily around the kitchen. The daily tea ritual wasn't just helping his veins, it was restoring his confidence. He found himself saying yes to things he might have avoided months ago. Longer walks, outings with friends, even dancing for a few songs at a neighbor's anniversary party. His legs no longer felt like reluctant passengers. They were willing partners again. He began keeping a simple journal on the counter. Each day, he wrote the teas he drank, how his legs felt, and one thing he was grateful for. Flipping back through the pages after a few weeks, he could see the progress. Early entries mentioned heaviness, swelling, or restless nights. Later pages spoke of long walks, afternoons in the garden, easier mornings. And woven throughout was gratitude for Emily, for Margaret, for the teas, for the slow but steady return of his strength. One evening, as Andrew stood at the sink rinsing his teacup, he caught sight of himself in the darkened kitchen window. He saw a man who looked healthier, more alive than he had a year ago, not because he'd discovered a magic cure, but because he had made the decision again and again, day after day, to take small steps toward better health. The teas were a tool, yes, but they were also a symbol of his commitment to himself. It struck him that this wasn't a journey with an endpoint. He wasn't looking to finish or complete his care. This was a path he intended to keep walking, as naturally as breathing, as easily as pouring another cup. And the beauty of it was that each day, in its own way, would be steeped in care, comfort, and the quiet knowledge that he was doing what he could to keep his veins healthy and his life full. It was a crisp spring morning when Andrew realized just how far he had come. The air was cool and clear, the sky brushed with the soft pink of sunrise. He stepped out onto his porch, mug of ginger tea in hand, and looked out at his small but thriving garden. The tulips were pushing through the soil, their green shoots a promise of brighter days ahead. For months, his mornings had begun like this. Tea in hand, a quiet moment to himself before the day began. It wasn't just a pleasant habit anymore, it was a reminder of the journey he had taken. He thought back to those first heavy-legged mornings when walking to the mailbox felt like a chore, and swelling around his ankles made him reluctant to move too much. Back then, he'd told himself it was just part of getting older, but he knew now it was more than that. It was a warning, one he had chosen to listen to. The choice to act had been small at first, a single cup of ginger tea, then ginkgo, garlic, horse chestnut. One by one, he had added them to his days, each with its own quiet gift. He hadn't changed everything overnight. Instead, he'd layered these habits gently, the way you add stitches to a scarf, until, before you know it, you're wrapped in warmth. And now he was wrapped in something better than warmth. He was wrapped in health. The difference was in the way his legs felt when he climbed the steps to his porch, in the ease of walking the long way to the market just because the sun was shining, in the fact that his evenings were no longer clouded by the dull ache of swelling or the sharp pinch of nighttime cramps. His legs felt like they belonged to him again, not something to manage or endure, but something he could trust. Emily noticed it too. One afternoon, they took the grandchildren to the park. The kids darted ahead, their laughter ringing across the playground, and without thinking, Andrew broke into a light jog to catch up. Emily's eyes widened. "Look at you," she said, smiling. He laughed, realizing how natural it had felt, and how impossible it would have seemed a year ago. His neighbor Margaret had seen the change as well. "You've got a spring in your step these days," she remarked over the fence one morning. He told her about the teas, about how they had become a kind of anchor for him. She nodded knowingly. "It's not just the teas," she said. "It's that you've made time for yourself again. That's what makes the difference." She was right. The teas were the tools, but the real transformation had come from the decision to care, to show up for himself every day, even in small ways. That choice had rippled outward, touching everything else in his life. His diet had shifted naturally toward fresher, lighter meals. He walked more often, sometimes simply because it felt good to move. His sleep was deeper, his mornings brighter. There was one moment that stood out to him above all others. It was a late afternoon in early spring, and he had been working in the garden for hours, pruning, planting, hauling soil. In the past, such a day would have left him hobbling to his chair, aching and worn. But that day, as he stood back to admire his work, he realized his legs felt strong. Tired, yes, but the good kind of tired, the kind that comes from using your body well, not from struggling against it. That night, as he sipped his evening tea, a blend of cinnamon and lemon balm, he thought about what pain-free, strong legs meant to him now. It wasn't about running marathons or chasing youth, it was about freedom. Freedom to walk where he wanted, to work in his garden, to play with his grandchildren without worrying about paying for it later. Freedom to say yes to life's invitations without hesitation. He also knew his journey wasn't just his own. Every time he shared his story with Emily, with Margaret, with the man at the tea stall in the market, he saw a spark of recognition. People wanted to feel good in their bodies. They wanted to believe it wasn't too late. And Andrew, standing there with the proof in his own legs, knew it wasn't. Now, each cup of tea felt like both a celebration and a promise. A celebration of the progress he had made and a promise to keep going. Not because he feared losing what he had gained, but because the care itself had become part of who he was. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned to gold, Andrew sat on his porch and looked at the world around him. He thought about the simple steps that had brought him here, the teas, the walks, the choice to keep moving forward. He thought about the man he had been a year ago and the man he was now, and he felt, more than anything, grateful. Grateful for the strength in his legs, grateful for the ease in his steps, grateful for the small, steady choices that had given him back not just his circulation, but his confidence, his independence, his joy. And as he raised his mug in a quiet toast to the evening, Andrew smiled to himself. Pain-free, strong legs weren't just possible, they were his reality. And he intended to keep them that way, one warm, healing cup at a time. When Andrew first noticed the heaviness in his legs, he thought it was just another sign of getting older. Walking to the mailbox left him tired, swelling crept in by evening, and cramps would jolt him awake at night. But that quiet discomfort was the beginning of a journey he didn't yet know he needed to take. It started simply, a single cup of ginger tea one morning, inspired by his grandmother's words about keeping the blood happy. From there, the path unfolded naturally, ginkgo to warm his hands and feet, garlic to guard his blood, horse chestnut to lighten his legs, witch hazel to protect his veins, olive leaf to keep his arteries young, lemon balm to calm his mind, hibiscus to lift his heart, turmeric to fight inflammation, cinnamon to comfort and heal. Each tea played its part, each cup a small act of care. Along the way, Andrew began noticing the changes. Lighter legs, steadier energy, longer walks without dread, evenings free from the constant ache. What began as a health experiment became a daily ritual, a moment to slow down and listen to his body. And in caring for himself, he found more than improved circulation. He found the freedom to move, to say yes to life again, to feel truly alive in his own skin. Andrew's story is proof that it's never too late to begin. Change doesn't have to start with something big. Sometimes it's as simple as one warm cup, one gentle choice, one step forward. So if your legs are slowing you down, let Andrew's journey remind you the path back to strength and freedom might be waiting in the simplest of daily choices. Start today, and let your best days carry you forward.